Take me home, 'cause I may die tomorrow, but I will live today. Take me home, 'cause I may die tomorrow, but I will live today.
I have been really looking forward to this for a long time because ever since the first test bikes of the Interceptor Bear 650 was spied about a year ago, a few things were obvious. The first was that this was going to have more expensive suspension, which probably would have had more travel. Then there was the fact that this was going to be a more premium bike because we could see that it had a TFT display. And finally, the logic was that it was going to be lighter because it doesn't have that big dual exhaust setup from the Interceptor. And one more thing about that appealed to me was that this small exhaust meant that the bike was going to be slimmer, and that should have made it nicer to ride in the city. That is the logic. Today I can finally put it to test and tell myself and you whether this is actually the nicest of the RE 650s. The Bear is meant to be Royal Enfield's take of a scrambler on the Interceptor platform, and to make that happen they moved to a bigger 19-inch front wheel, a smaller 17-inch rear wheel. There is more suspension travel at both ends. The seat and the rear subframe is a little different. The subframe has a slight kink that's going upwards. The frame itself has been strengthened, especially around the headstock area, and that more or less is the extent of the changes towards the chassis when it comes to this bike versus the Interceptor. Now, given that this is a scrambler, you might be surprised with the riding position. First of all, the seat height has gone up. I'll give you a demonstration of what that's like in a bit. But what was surprising to me is that it's still a fairly lean forward riding position. You now have a nice wide handlebar, that is a good thing. But it's not upright. It's not like you're sitting on a dirt bike-ish sort of thing. You have a slight lean forward, and in general, this is more like a nice roadster to me than a scrambler. There are other elements of the seating position that I like. The foot pegs have been repositioned compared to the Interceptor and the Continental GT. Slightly lower, slightly further forward, and with this seat height and this handlebar position, I really like the foot peg placement. I also find less of that issue with banging the shins on the foot pegs while moving the bike around. It is still there, and shorter riders will find that more, but it doesn't seem to be as much of an issue here. The other big complaint with the Interceptor in general is that its seat was not very nice, even if you optioned the touring seat. This seat seems to be much nicer. It is a slightly firm seat, but over the course of a day, I found this to be quite comfortable. Now, let's talk about seat height. 830 mm. To show you what that's like, we're going to call Ashley in. Ashley is our resident seat height tester, apart from being a veteran photographer. It's 830 mm. Ashley is 5'6". Let's see what this looks like. Right, so he is on his tiptoes on both feet, and another thing to keep in mind is that this bike only comes with a side stand, and if you park it in a place where it leans over quite a bit, like the Himalayan 450, you will be aware of the weight. That's what the seating position looks like. Thanks, Ashley. Speaking of weight, now despite all the changes that have happened here, especially with the exhaust, the actual weight difference between this and the Interceptor is just 2 kilos. This is still a 216 kg motorcycle, and you do feel it at low speeds. But the actual riding experience is quite different, and a lot of it has improved when you come to the chassis. Now, in terms of handling, this is a much nicer bike because the chassis feels more neutral and planted. At high speeds, the Interceptor always had a tendency to start developing a small weave. None of that here. You can sit up to 130, 140 kilometers an hour and it is stable. So a lot of people are going to like that. In the corners, again, there's this solid planted feel. You are aware that it's a long, heavy motorcycle, but it holds the line well. And as long as you're respectful of how big it is, you'll actually have a lot of fun in the corners. There are a few things that have changed that are worth mentioning. This bike now moves to new MRF Nilo Rex tires. In my opinion, these do a superb job of looking like the Pirelli Scorpion Rally STRs. On good surfaces, they're actually quite grippy, they feel nice, but on less than perfect surfaces, the sense of feedback is a little mushy, little hard to read. So they're all right, they're not fantastic. What I do like is that Royal Enfield has worked on the brakes, and the result of that is that the brake bite, the initial bite, is now sharper, so you don't have to put that much effort as often as you used to earlier. But again, when you are moving at high speeds and you want to get on the brakes hard, you're aware that this is a big bike, you would have liked a little more braking performance, and the rear ABS tends to come on quite easily. So the braking is an improvement over the Interceptors, but not really at a very sporty level. In general, the overall dynamics package has improved, but something else that I like is the fact that this bike feels easier to manage in the city just thanks to that exhaust. The widest part of the bike now feels like the handlebars. On the Interceptor and the Conti. You really have to be careful about where those pipes stick out. Not so much here, and you can get through gaps with less mental effort required, which just makes this bike nicer to ride in the city. But above and beyond everything else, my favorite aspect of this bike is the engine. Now, this is the first time Royal Enfield has made some meaningful changes to the motor in terms of power and torque outputs. Power output has remained the same, but with this new 2-in-1 exhaust, the company has also managed to pull out a little more torque from the engine. Now, I'm not going to tell you that those 3-4 Nm of torque have really changed the riding experience. It's not particularly that, but the fact that this engine feels differently tuned, it feels a little more alive, a little more exciting, and I like the sound as well. It not only sounds louder than the Interceptor, but it also has a more sporty growl, and that just enriches the riding experience. There is also the fact that the overall engine tuning is more sporty and engaging with a crisper throttle response, and the Bear definitely feels quicker than the other 650s. That reflects in our performance tests as well, where the Bear managed to be the first RE650 to break the 6-second barrier in our 0 to 100 test. General highway performance is also very good, and the engine feels relaxed at 100 kph with the rev counter reading just over 4000 rpm in 6th gear. As for how it feels in the city, things are quite familiar to the other RE650s. This engine is wide and it generates a fair amount of heat at traffic lights, so it's worthwhile keeping your legs and feet well protected. And you'll also have to get used to the heavy clutch. But overall, this is easily the most fun of the RE650s, and it makes for quite an enjoyable roadster. Now, the reason I call it a roadster and not a scrambler, for one, is the riding position, but two, and the big deal here, is this. Now, Royal Enfield has sometimes created amazing suspension on some of its bikes, like the Classic 350 and the Himalayan 450, and disappointingly firm suspension on others, particularly the Hunter 350. Thankfully, this setup is not as stiff as the Hunter or the Super Meteor and Shotgun 650. But if you were expecting a plush and absorptive suspension from what is supposed to be a scrambler, you're not going to find it here. The problem is largely at the rear, where the suspension feels firm at all times and it conveys every imperfection in the road to the rider. The Bear made a particularly bad first impression because our bike came to us with the suspension preload set to maximum. Reducing this certainly helped, and it brought the comfort down to just about acceptable levels, but it did not change the fact that this is a firmly set up motorcycle. Overall, the suspension setup is not harsh. I would not call it a deal breaker, but it is not comfortable either, especially if you live in an area that does not have very good roads. Now, I believe that this bike has ended up with such firm suspension because Royal Enfield is really chasing a fun-to-ride character in their motorcycles, to the point that they've actually stationed a team of chassis and dynamics developers in Spain testing these bikes on beautiful roads and even on great handling test tracks. That is very nice, but I would also request the company maybe please set up a new comfort department stationed in a place like Mumbai, where you can find a nice balance between that sportiness and overall comfort, especially in a country like India. But what about off-road riding? Well, at the press of a button, you can deactivate the rear ABS, and there's no traction control for you to bother with. With plenty of torque on hand, it is easy to spin that rear tire up. But the long and stable character of the bike also ensures that you'll feel comfortably in control if you want to fool around on a gravel road. There's also plenty of ground clearance to enjoy some light, rocky trail riding, but once you get carried away, you will soon realize that this bike shouldn't be taken too seriously off-road, and the front fork can bottom out quite easily on big landings. But still, there is a decent amount of capability in this motorcycle, and while it's not really an off-roader, I like to think of it as a rugged street bike that you can ride without any tension. The Bear 650 is priced between 3.4 and 3.6 lakh rupees ex showroom, which puts it slightly lower than the Super Meteor and the Shotgun, but about 30 to 40,000 rupees more than the Interceptor. For that extra money, you're getting what I think is a very stylish looking motorcycle. It has a great stance with that 19-inch front wheel, that big ground clearance, lovely color schemes. There are 5 colors in total. You're also getting the upside down fork and the TFT display. This TFT comes from the Himalayan 450, and just like there, it's a beautiful looking unit, really one of the nicest displays out there. But also like the Himalayan, it has this very fiddly and annoying toggle switch that's just a pain to use. Anyway, back to the overall features and fit and finish of the motorcycle. The Bear 650 does a good job of feeling like a premium special bike. You have nice aluminum switch cubes, these adjustable levers are nice to look at, and I love the look of this painted frame. That being said, I do have a few nitpicks. This bunch of wires coming out of here could have been managed a little better. There's just black tape around it that doesn't look so nice. Then there's these indicators, they're really big. I don't think they suit the look of the bike so well. Maybe Royal Enfield had to do this for regulatory requirements where the indicators have to be at a certain width, who knows. The final thing I don't like is that even at this price, this fuel tank cap is not hinged. One more thing I will grumble about is the fact that you will have to deal with tube tires, because those nice side lace spoked wheels that support tubeless tires on the Himalayan 450 are not available as an option here. But overall, this is definitely a stylish and desirable motorcycle, and from a value for money standpoint, I think Royal Enfield has done just fine here. So how do we wrap this up? Well, the Bear 650 to me is a fun to ride motorcycle. That's the primary thing that I remember with this bike, is that I had more fun riding this than pretty much any other 650. That alone makes this the nicest of the 650s to me. That is confirmed. However, to end, I can't help feel a little disappointed, because at the end of the day, this is a good motorcycle, but it had the potential to be a great one.